Today we're going to move on to focusing on the mind as the object of this shamatha practice. And with all shamatha practices, one thing that is important is this idea of bare attention, meaning we are observing the object directly. For example, when we're using the breath, we are observing directly the sensations of the breath, and we're not visualizing, imagining the breath and so forth. Also today, when we're observing the mind and all the thoughts and so forth that come up in the mind, we are observing that directly, meaning we're not sort of thinking about our thoughts and emotions or making a commentary about them. We're simply observing them directly. So again, this idea of bare attention. So what we're going to do now is we begin with a meditation where we are moving in towards observing the mind from the sense objects, and all the while using this bare attention. And then I'll explain the practice in more detail after this meditation. So let's begin with that meditation. Settling the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. Using the out breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. Allowing the breathing to flow naturally and effortlessly. Not trying to control or manipulate the breath in any way. with each out breath, letting go of any thoughts that may have arisen. Simply allowing the mind to come to rest in the present moment. Focusing on the sensations of the breath throughout the body. While remaining in that quiet, meditative state, open your eyes and bring your attention to the visual field in front of you. The visual field in which shapes and colours are appearing. And without conceptualizing, without labeling or projecting, simply with bare attention, observe the colours and shapes appearing in that field. And in the scene, let there be just the scene. Now close your eyes and bring your attention to the auditory field, the field within which sounds are appearing. And again, without labeling or projecting, simply with bare attention, observe the sounds arising in the auditory field. And in the heard, let there be just the heard. bring your attention to the field of the body, the field within which tactile sensations are appearing. And again, without visualizing, imagining, projecting, simply with bare attention, observe the sensations arising within the field of the body. And in the sensed, let there be just the sensed. Now allow your eyes to be at least partially open, resting your gaze in the space in front of you. So not really looking at anything in particular, keeping the eyes soft and relaxed. And now bring your attention to the field of the mind and observe the mind and whatever is arising in that field. Thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images. Simply observe these mental events as they arise and pass, without following thoughts, without trying to get rid of them. Simply be like an impartial observer or witness, observing them as they arise and pass. Observing them with bare attention, directly. If you're new to this practice and you're not sure where to focus, then every now and again, deliberately generate a thought. Any thought will do. And watch that thought as it arises in your mind. And then watch it as it disappears back into the mind. And then keep your attention right where it was, and see what comes up next in that space. If you get caught up in a thought and got carried away, then as before, the first thing to do is relax. And then release grasping onto that thought and very gently return to observing the mind. before we look at that practice in more detail, let's begin with a little review of what we covered yesterday. So of course in this retreat, this mindfulness retreat, we're looking at two aspects of mindfulness here. One is the cultivating of mindfulness, i.e. improving our mindfulness, strengthening our mindfulness, in other words, improving our attention skills, developing single point of concentration. This is called shamatha practice. And then tomorrow afternoon and Saturday we'll be looking at how to apply that mindfulness to gain an insight into the nature of reality. This is called vipassana practice. So in the shamatha practice, we saw that there are three qualities we are cultivating in this practice. That the basis is relaxation. On that basis we develop stability, in other words, the ability to focus without becoming distracted. And then on the basis of a stable mind, we improve the clarity of our attention. And the general recommendation for what object to use in this practice is use the object that works best for you. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. And to discuss that, I'd like to read a little bit more from this Attention Revolution, the book from Alan Wallace. And he says the following, page 6. To guide meditators along these 10 stages, and the 10 stages are these 9 stages plus the result shamatha, he says, I have chosen from Buddhist teachings 3 techniques that I have found effective for people in the modern world. These 3 techniques are the basis for the 3 divisions of this book. For the first 4 stages, you should practice whatever method you find easiest. By stage 5, the mind is relatively stable and you can move on to subtler techniques. So remember, stage 4 was when we can focus on the object the entire session without ever completely losing it. For achieving the first 4 stages, I recommend the practice of mindfulness of breathing, variations of which can be found in Zen, Vipassana, and Tibetan Buddhism. Mindfulness of breathing means settling your awareness on the sensations involved in breathing, continually returning your attention there whenever your mind wanders. Beginning with the 5th stage, I recommend a method called settling the mind in its natural state. So that's the name he gives to this practice we're doing today, the practice of observing the mind. In this technique, you direct your attention to mental experiences, all the events, that is, thoughts, mental images and emotions that arise in the domain of the mind. This method is drawn from the Dzogchen, or Great Perfection lineage, but is found in other Buddhist traditions as well. With the instructions for the 8th attentional stage onward, we move on to the still subtler practice of maintaining awareness of awareness itself. This technique is called shamatha without an object. Here the practice is not so much one of developing attentional stability and clarity as it is of discovering the stillness and luminosity inherent in awareness itself. So we're going to begin to look at that later this afternoon. The training in mindfulness of breathing may be helpful to anyone, including those seeking to prevent or treat attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. Many people find the second practice, that of settling the mind in its natural state, to be more challenging, but some meditators take to it naturally. Likewise, the practice of awareness is subtler still, but it may be optimal from the beginning for those who are strongly drawn to it. You may use any one of the 3 methods to progress along all 10 stages of attentional development, or you may follow the sequence described in this book. How fast you progress will depend on the level of your commitment and the degree to which your lifestyle and environment support such practice. So what he's suggesting is one of two things. Either find an object that works for you, and pick that object and then stay with that object all the way along all the stages of development. Another option that he is suggesting is that for the first 4 stages to use mindfulness of breathing, because many people find that the easiest. So then we can progress along those stages, the mind becomes more stable, more clear, then we can shift to a more subtler technique such as observing the mind or even resting in awareness, and to continue the rest of the way using one of those techniques. So today we're going to look at this second technique of observing the mind, or as Alan Wallace calls it, settling the mind in its natural state. And that's what we had a little taste of for the last part of that meditation we just did. And many of you probably found that much more challenging than focusing on the breath. And again, usually for 2 reasons. One is that the mind is much more subtle than the breath. The object is much more subtle. And secondly, we don't really have a habit of observing our mind. Our very strong habit, rather, is when something comes up in our mind, some thought, emotion, memory or something, we grab hold of it and off we go. Or if it's unpleasant, we try and suppress it. So we're not in the habit of simply observing the mind. But as Shantideva said as I quoted from Shantideva yesterday, no matter how difficult something seems, everything with practice becomes easy. So if we practice this, it'll become easier and easier and easier to observe the mind. So the object in this practice, and we have to be clear about what the object of course is, the object in this practice is the mind plus any mental events that arise in the mind. So we're talking of course about thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images and so on. What is not part of the object is sensory objects. So we're not focusing on sounds, sensations in the body, visual objects and so forth. If they arise, we just ignore them. If we get caught up in a sound or sensation in the body, let it go and come back to the mind. So we're observing the mind and mental events, not sensory objects. Now, like the breath, of course, by observing the mind, the goal of this practice is shamatha, a calm, clear and focused mind. But some of the side benefits of this particular practice are that we will become the masters of our mind instead of the slaves of our mind. Now, particularly in our modern society, we often tend to be the slaves of our mind. And often that comes because of our lifestyle. We often lead very hectic, fast-paced lives, constantly bombarded by stimulus. Our mind is churning over all the time, non-stop, blah, 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 all day. And of course that is very tiring and it often overwhelms us. And what we sometimes try to do is we try to make the mind still by trying to suppress all of that stuff. Of course that doesn't work, it just makes it worse. In this practice, we are simply observing the mind. So we don't need to fight with the mind to make it still. In fact, if we fight with the mind, it gets worse. All we got to do is step back and watch. Because if we step back and watch all of these mental events, we're no longer feeding them. Because every time we get caught up in them and follow them, or every time we try to suppress them, we're feeding them. Which means the habit of this stuff coming up will get stronger and stronger and stronger. So if through this practice we just step back and watch them, we're not feeding them anymore. Which means the habit of thoughts, emotions, memories and so forth coming up will get weaker and weaker and weaker. our mind will naturally become more quiet and still. Also, of course, now when we suppress these thoughts, emotions and memories and so forth, and usually we suppress them because we don't know how to deal with them, suppressing them is not really effectively dealing with them. It's like building up a pressure cooker. And also, by suppressing these mental events, they often manifest as a lot of physical problems in the body. And then we also tend to project a lot of negativity onto the people around us. For example, if we have a problem with anger, and we don't know how to deal with anger, and we just try and suppress that anger often manifests as a lot of physical problems in the body, a stiff neck and maybe stomach problems and so forth. And because we're suppressing it, we can feel the anger, but because we're suppressing and really denying it, we project it. Yes, there's anger, but it's not me, it's them. They're the angry ones. And so we project that onto other people because we can sense it, but we've denied it. So therefore it causes a lot of mental and physical problems for ourselves, and then we project a lot of this negativity onto the people around us. If we do this practice of observing the mind and mental events, not only will our mind become naturally more quiet and still, but it stops suppressing. And so it stops all of that problem from suppressing. And part of being able to, the first part of being able to deal with these things is acknowledging them. And so simply observing them arise and pass is the beginning of being able to effectively deal with all of these things. So we really will become the masters of our mind. And if we really get in this habit of being able to observe whatever arises in our mind, then in future, if some strong mental event were to arise, some strong thought, emotional memory, we could simply be present with it without it overwhelming us. Because if we look at what a thought, emotional memory really is, from its own side, it's virtually nothing. It has no power. These mental events only have power to harm us if we give them power. And we give them power either by identifying with them and following them, or trying to suppress them. Then they have a lot of power to harm us. But if we can simply be present with them and observe them, they can't do anything to harm us. So not only will our mind naturally become more quiet and still, we'll become the masters of our mind. So this practice has enormous benefits. So let's look at the practice itself, and then we'll go back into the practice. So again, to talk about the practice, I'd like to read a little bit more from this Attention Revolution, the book. On page 83, he describes the practice. The object of mindfulness in the practice of settling the mind in its natural state is no longer the subtle sensations of the breath, but the space of the mind and whatever events arise in that space. The object of introspection, as in the earlier practice of mindfulness of breathing, is the quality of the attention with which you are observing the mind. As you venture into this practice, I would encourage you to memorize the quintessential instructions, which are: settle your mind without distraction and without grasping. Practicing without distraction means not allowing your mind to be carried away by thoughts and sense impressions. Be present here and now, and when thoughts arise pertaining to the past or future, or ruminations about the present, don't be abducted by them. As you hike on this trail of shamatha, don't be a hitchhiker catching a ride with any of the thoughts or images that whiz through your mind. Rather, be like a kestrel hovering motionlessly as it faces the wind, slightly moving its wings and tail feathers to adjust to changes in the currents of the air. Even when your attention is settled in the present, you may still grasp onto the appearances to the mind. Whenever you prefer one mental object over another, whenever you try to control the contents of your mind, and whenever you identify with anything at all, grasping has set in. Here is the challenge at hand. Be attentive to everything that comes up in your mind, but don't grasp onto anything. In this practice, let your mind be like the sky. Whatever moves through it, the sky never reacts. It doesn't stop anything moving through it. It doesn't hold on to anything that's present, nor does it control anything. The sky doesn't prefer rainbows to clouds, butterflies to jet planes. Whatever comes up in the field of awareness, without distraction or grasping, just let it be. So in this practice, we are not trying to make the mind still. If the mind is still, observe that stillness. If the mind is not still, if there's lots of thoughts and emotions and so forth coming up, observe them. In this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open. Of course, in general, in meditation, the general recommendation is to have the eyes slightly open. But particularly in this practice, it's very much recommended to have the eyes open. So let's have a look at that and why that is the case. So again, reading from this book from Alan Watts, Attention Revolution, on page 86, he says the following. And he's quoting a meditation text, and the instruction in the meditation text is, let your gaze be vacant. And now he's commenting on that. He says, in this practice, it is important that your eyes are open, vacantly resting your gaze in the space in front of you. If you have not meditated with your eyes open, you may find this uncomfortable, but I encourage you to get used to it. Blink as often as you like, and don't strain your eyes in any way. Let them be as relaxed as if you were daydreaming with your eyes open. By leaving the eyes open and while focusing your attention on the domain of mental events, the artificial barrier between inner and outer begins to dissolve. Especially in our materialist society, we have gotten used to the idea that our thoughts and all other mental events are inside our heads. But this has never been demonstrated scientifically. All that is known in this regard is that mental events are correlated with neural events, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are located in the same place. Even without this materialist assumption that the mind is nothing more than a function of the brain, we naturally have a sense that we are looking out on the world from behind our eyes. But this sense of an independent subject or ego inside the head is an illusion. There is no scientific support for such a belief, and when it is inspected through rigorous contemplative inquiry, this autonomous thinker and observer inside the head is nowhere to be found. In this practice, by leaving your eyes open, but by directing your attention to the mind, this conceptually superimposed demarcation between inner and outer begins to erode. You begin to recognize that your thoughts are not occurring in here in your head, nor are they occurring out there in space. This practice challenges the existence of an absolutely objective space of the physical senses that is absolutely separate from the subjective space of the mind. You are now on a path to realizing the meaning of non-duality. So just to make a few comments on that. When I first started meditating, I was very agitated, and I found that having the eyes slightly open, I was just too much agitation. So actually I started meditating with my eyes closed, which was helpful for agitation. But then, of course, over time, I realized that that was, I was moving more into dullness. And then some years ago, when I was introduced to this practice, and having the eyes open, at first I found it very uncomfortable because I'd never meditated with the eyes open. But as he said, I quickly got used to it. And now generally I only meditate with the eyes open. With the eyes open, of course, in this practice, we're not looking at anything. As he said in the meditation text, is just rest your gaze in the space in front of you. It's a little bit like in daily life, sometimes we're having our eyes open, but we're daydreaming. So we're caught up in some daydream. So we're not really looking at anything at that time. That's what we're doing in this practice. Similarly, the eyes are open, but we are focusing on the mind and thoughts and emotions. Now, what we don't want to do with the eyes is to strain them in any way. So we're not trying to deliberately unfocus them and not trying to sort of keep them open. Just blink as often as you need. Just rest them in the space in front of you. Now you can have them either slightly open or naturally open, whichever you prefer. The advantages, of course, of having the eyes open, one advantage of having the eyes open is it helps improve clarity. With the eyes closed, much more easy to drift into dullness. And also, of course, having the eyes closed, it's much more easy to drift into the past and future. With the eyes open, it's much easier to stay in the present moment. And also in this meditation, if we, in meditation, we develop the habit of being able to observe thoughts